Hello and welcome to a new video series where we'll be bringing in other people from the accessibility space, having conversations about accessibility, asking questions that don't normally get asked, and generally having conversations to see what we can do to push things along in the right direction. If you're new here, my name is James Warnken. I work in the digital accessibility space, making sure that everybody has the same access and opportunity to a great experience regardless of what device, assistive technology, or personal preferences they have. For this first interview, we're going to be talking with a good friend and mentor of mine, Mike Hess from BIT, and I am super excited to hear what Mike has to say about this whole conversation. Let's get into it. Mike Hess, introduce yourself. Let everyone know who Mike Hess is.
Good day, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Hess. I am Executive Director and Founder at Blind Institute of Technology, a Colorado-based nonprofit truly making a global difference. I have been legally blind or blind my entire life, and I'm in my 50s now, so it's been a minute. And let's see, I was originally brought up and raised in the Northeast Ohio region, so right on Lake Erie.
Shout out to Ohio.
Go Buckeyes. And my mom moved my brother and I out to the Denver metro area when I was in junior high. So shortly after the Mayflower landed, it seems like now. And that was I've been out here in the Denver metro area ever since. So that's a little bit about me, James, and I really appreciate you having me on your program.
Yeah, and so this is episode 1. This is it. We're trying something new. We're trying to bring other people, so you're not just hearing what James Warnken thinks about accessibility, and Mike Hess definitely has a lot to say about accessibility and what this space looks like and what it has looked like and maybe where it's going. So excited to start it off with you, Mike, for some background information. Mike and I met through a sort of coincidence of introductions. I was talking to an organization in Nebraska, not either of our states, about accessibility, and asked how I could learn about accessibility, and they connected me with Mike, and the rest is kind of history. Mike has been one of my mentors, even though he says that he's not a mentor. Absolutely has been. We've been working together for almost 2 years now under BIT. I've been helping with the accessibility stuff, and Mike has really helped open a lot of doors and opportunities, and actually connected me with some really cool companies and people along the way. So appreciate everything Mike has done, and that's why we're starting with Mike. So first question that I have for you, Mike, is a lot of times when your story is being shared, the whole concept of your corporate experience is usually included in there somewhere. And throughout your corporate experience, you mentioned that you were the token blind guy, or that you realized you were the token blind guy in your organization. And I would like to just get some clarity of what does being a token blind guy mean? And what were some of those signs, or what were some of the things you were seeing or hearing or feeling that sort of led you down the path of creating something like BIT?
It's a interesting, it's a very astute kind of background question too, James, that not many people have kind of dug into that at all. So, in the beginning of my corporate career, so again, I was in my early 20s, that I started in technology, and it was because I was engaged to my current wife, and my wife was married prior to me. She had 2 little girls who, I have adopted, and so I was engaged to a ready-made family, and but at the time, my eyesight was I've always been legally blind, and in my early 20s, my eyesight really started to dip. It started to diminish quite a bit. But pride kept me from identifying with a cane. And so I did everything I could to kind of fake, I could put my blind spot mostly on people's faces and all of that kind of stuff. And so, and I knew once I got into an organization, with zooming in and some of the preliminary, screen reader technologies at the time, like I knew I could, make it through, but so I would fake it. And until I, get, they're like, oh, we want to offer you the job. And that's when I'm like, I just wanted to let you know, like, I'm legally blind and here's what I need and da, 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 da. And so my whole career was really built on, this like, um, not being loud and proud, trying to, get past the gatekeepers and the decision makers within corporate America. And then after I started having success, in corporate America, is actually when I started becoming more, quite honestly, just comfortable and proud of my identity as an individual who was blind, and started using my cane, as a professional when I had, lots of projects and stuff under my belt. And then, quite honestly, it just became like it was impossible for me to fake it anymore. I was putting myself at risk, because my eyesight was diminishing so much. But like it was just always evident to me that uh, there wasn't anybody else who was blind or visually impaired. And quite honestly, I never bumped into anybody in wheelchairs. Never heard of, nobody ever heard of anybody using sign language. Neurodiversity wasn't even a topic back in the day. Clearly, there were neurodivergent people, especially in tech, but it wasn't talked about. Disability is one of those do not talk about conversations in corporate America in general. And I remember like always wearing it as like this badge of honor, like, oh man, look, I've overcome, I've this, I've that. But later in my career, actually, is running BIT is when I found out like that sense of tokenism actually creates trauma in individuals, and we could wear it, we could be, bravado and wear it as a badge of honor. But quite honestly, and when I learned about that is when I started thinking back about, like, I was always terrified. I always felt like I had to work, twice as hard and try to, prove. I knew I had to work twice as hard for half as much, and I always had to prove myself way more than my peers. Having a disability in corporate America, like you have to be an overachiever, and that kind of pressure, like it's not good for anybody. It really isn't. So yeah, it's a great question. I reminisce about it quite a bit, and I had a lot of wonderful relationships that I've still carried on to, where I'm at today from my career. But yeah, it's interesting, like looking in the rearview mirror about like that whole time.
Well, and going back to when you and I first met, you've gotten to sort of watch me go through that experience as well. Coming out of college with a disability and being legally blind, I was applying for jobs, and I was usually waiting until my second interview to say I was legally blind. I wouldn't even share that in the first interview. So I was faking it until I made it. And you and I have had dozens of conversations about of owning and leveraging and using it as sort of an advantage, which I think I've done a pretty good job of adopting, and making that a part of who I am as an individual. I've done several podcasts talking about my loss aversion or my imposter syndrome and things like that, just purely because of the conversations that I had with you and Kara early on in my sort of accessibility journey. And so it's interesting how similar that sort of path is, and how it tends to work, regardless of the time or the specifics of the disability. But you mentioned like going into those interviews, when you were faking it to get into that career, and now you're sort of sitting on the opposite side of the table with BIT being staffing and professional development, just out of curiosity, in talking with organizations that are hiring and recruiting and looking for diverse talent, including people with disabilities, what are some of those key traits or skills or characteristics that are making people realize that the disability community is not to be discounted?
Well, it's again, it's a very good question, James. It's like I literally my phone call right before this was we actually were part of getting an amazing young lady a senior role at a Colorado-based credit union, and we're talking about exactly this, and the chief people officer at the organization was asking me like we're talking about just how simple BIT had made the process, and how we always start with organizations. We have training called empowerment training, and it's solid, really solid organizational development training that helps employers start to feel what I always say, less squishy, less uncomfortable, not exactly completely comfortable, but less uncomfortable around a pretty challenging topic, and that's disability. And people in general are uncomfortable with the topic around disability because they think of very much as a loss. And we attempt to train and educate organizations on, okay, well, let's talk about that, fear of loss. Okay, it's loss aversion. Let's talk about another very legal, nebulous conversation called reasonable accommodation, and just how many times how incredibly reasonable it really is. So, so everything that we do starts with that kind of education, and then it leads to organizations saying, yeah, we really would like to see if, some of our openings fit the talent pool that you have. This particular credit union went through our training literally a year ago. We got contracts in place. We ended up having somebody that's a senior business analyst looking for work. They just happened to be looking for a senior business analyst. They went through 4 rounds of interviews, and now they are just, they really are thrilled about, just quite honestly, how easy and effortless this whole process has been, getting them an incredibly talented young lady to be part of their team full time. And so to me, everything just starts with organizations being a little bit curious.
Yeah. And from me, I always sort of, from what you mentioned earlier about like doing twice the work for half the outcome, like I very much relate to that. Like I've always said yes to everything, regardless of what the pay was or how good the work was or how much I enjoyed it, just to try to get that experience, to try to sort of overcompensate for what I was trying to do, if that's even the right term. And so I don't, from what you just said, and from my own opinion, like you don't have to be the master of all. Of like you can pick an area and sort of settle into it, and you don't have to be the number one star or anything like that. It's really more about the organization and how comfortable they are, more so than about the individual and the skills and the talents and all of that they bring to the table. Because if you're qualified, that doesn't always guarantee the position. And if the organization isn't open, that just makes it even more difficult.
Absolutely. And that's so our approach is, and we coach our our candidates to actually be super open about the full disclosure. And again, I know it's a very personal choice. However, like where I am now in my life, and the amazing talent that I've been able to be surrounded by during this BIT journey, like we should be super proud of the obstacles that we've overcome. And we need to be able to let organizations know, like, hey, here's here's everything I've had to overcome. So we like hiring me is actually, like, you're bringing on a superhero because of like I'm so used to overcoming obstacles.
Right. And you don't get the choice as to whether you overcome it or not. You have to.
Yeah, and it's really about connecting that those dots for these organizations, and the method seems to be working.
Yeah. Well, and like 4 years ago, I didn't even like talking to people one on one about my disability. And at the gala in Philly back in October, I was in front of 100 people, if not more, talking about my lived experience with a disability. And like, you just gotta sort of step outside of the comfort zone and sort of own it at some point. Because if you would have asked me to do that 4 years ago, I would have told you were crazy.
Well, it was actually, when you reached out to me and you had asked me like, hey, will you mentor me? I what like it wasn't so, and I like so I'm happy, I've got 3 kids, and I for me it is incumbent upon individuals with experience to pass on their experience. Um, Not everybody, again, having kids, wants to hear my experience. So when I had a young, enthusiastic person from close to my hometown reach out to me and asked if I would share some of my experience with, I was like, sure, because again, having 3 kids who don't always want to hear about my experience, I was thrilled about that, James, um, and knowing at the time, when I was asking you about, identifying as an individual with a disability, are you using a cane for self-identification and all those kind of things? Because, and I could hear the truly the power that you already had and you didn't even realize yet. And what was going to help that, the power of that, like, and again, this is somebody as an older person who, man, I wish I would have done this a little bit earlier. You hear tenured people say that all the time. I wish I would have done that a little bit more. So what I was attempting to pass on to you, and only time would tell that you would absolutely embrace this, was, don't wait until you're, an old guy like me to be loud and proud about the challenges that you've had to overcome. And you absolutely embraced it. And you are a young leader, just waiting for the right opportunity in the accessibility and education space.
Yeah, and like I could have taken our first conversation and stayed in my little comfy bubble and continued to try to learn about accessibility and just work it into the digital marketing work that I was doing. But for some reason, I decided to dive headfirst into it, and committing to something like that, it takes a lot, and the reward and the outcome and the opportunities that have come from me diving headfirst, and like I wouldn't trade that for anything. Getting to work with other people who want to get into this space and make an impact. Like there's over 1 billion websites out there. I can't make all of those accessible. So getting the opportunity to work with you guys and train other professionals on how to do this stuff, like that only benefits the greater good, like, which is what I'm trying to do. And so I want to ask my third question, because I think a lot of people are curious, and share what you can. But as far as where BIT is at now, with the sales force and the accessibility and the professional services and trainings, what does the pipeline at BIT look like? Is there anything you can share, as a foreshadowing or as a teaser for what's to come out of BIT out in Denver?
Oh, well, there are definitely some really cool things that I'm able to. So So everything that BIT does is all about workforce development. It's all about employment. Workforce development is part of employment. And, we have an amazing partnership with our friends at Salesforce. We actually, another tech giant called ServiceNow is, so it hasn't gone out to social media yet, but the collaboration has been offered and made between ServiceNow and BIT, which is super cool. So we're going to be helping ServiceNow in the very near future with their workforce development needs for people with disabilities. So super excited about that. And we are going to be absolutely offering our trainings. We're going to start with Salesforce, but we're going to be offering our trainings with instructors in GMT or GMT +1, +2 time zones very, very soon. And so therefore our classes, and we've had international students from Africa, Middle East, and Europe. We've had students from Asia, take our classes. However, our classes are always, the times are always very, Eastern or Central time zones, which make it really rough for participants across the globe. So very, very soon we're going to be offering those up. And then we have other classes that we are absolutely cooking up. Everything that we do from a training perspective is going to be industry recognized, credentialed, and it's going to be industry in demand courses. So everything that we're doing is about increasing the opportunities for professionals with disabilities in private industry.
Absolutely. And working alongside of you, that all is 100% true. And so I want to wrap up with telling the listener, the audience, if you're someone with a disability and you're looking for professional development, industry recognized certifications, absolutely go to blindit.org and sign up to become a candidate. The BIT train is not slowing down. I think 2 years ago it stopped at 9 3/4, and it's gone light years since then. So if you're not following and watching what's happening at BIT, you absolutely should be. And I just want to thank you, Mike, for jumping on for a few minutes to talk through some topics that don't get covered very often, or questions that maybe don't come up in your traditional interviews, or keynotes or golden hoodie speeches. It's always good to get some additional perspective and get more people in the conversation. You're already in it, but I wanted to try to approach it from a slightly different angle. So thank you for jumping on, and I will include links to all of the BIT socials and websites in the description as well. So
awesome. Well, thank you for an engaging conversation, James. And my best for you and your future is always there. And again, you are a young leader in the making, just taking this on. And thank you for being part of the solution.
absolutely. Thank you, Mike.